In the last video, I told you guys that I'm going to replace my Leica Q3 with this little bugger here, the Ricoh GR4. And in today's episode, I want to explain to you what's the reasoning behind it and if it all made sense or if I'm already regretting my decision. First of all, let's clarify one thing. I'm not planning on getting rid of this camera. This one will not go anywhere. However, the idea was to bring the GR4 and use it as my main camera on this trip during 9 days of very intense street photography. By the way, I'm here in Phuket, Thailand, which is usually not a place you would consider to be good for street photography. However, the last 9 days, like I said, were very intense and it was absolutely amazing for street photography. I will pop in a few photos here and there so you can get an idea. You'll learn more about that in a future video, so make sure that you're subscribed and you don't miss out on what's to come because it's gonna be really wild. So I was using this over the last 9 days, shooting thousands of images with the little Ricoh GR4. And that was actually the first time me using the camera. I've never used a Ricoh GR before. And this is something I would not recommend, using a camera that you use the first time on a trip. And especially if you're shooting in such a high pressure environment that I was shooting in. However, I still had my Leica Q3 with me as a backup, and that gave me the confidence to give it a shot. Well, no pun intended here. And in fact, there were 2 occasions where I actually had to use the Leica Q3, but more on that a little bit later on in this video. Now, why did I buy the Ricoh GR4? Well, I guess a lot of you already know that I'm a Leica Q user since the first one came out back in 2015. And ever since, it has been the perfect camera for me. So why now pick this? And actually, there's only a few cameras out there that come somewhat close to the Leica Q in terms of focal length and features. And that is maybe the Fuji X70, which is very old by now. The Ricoh GRs, the ones, of course, with a 28mm equivalent lens. And also there's now the medium format version, the Fuji rangefinder, which is somewhat similar, but I don't know. For me, it's a little bit too big and I prefer the Leica Q over it. Now, the reason I always preferred the Leica Q over the Ricoh GR and also the Fuji X70 is the fact that this opens up to f1.7, and that makes it pretty easy to blur out the background even though the lens is fairly wide. However, when doing street photography, that doesn't really matter because I mostly shoot stop down, so to f8 to maybe even f16. So the aperture of 1.7 is not really relevant to me anymore. And over the last few years, I thought I should give the Ricoh GR a try. And with this upcoming trip and Ricoh announcing the GR4, I thought now it's finally time to give it a try. And in case I want to travel as light as possible, I mean, look at this. This camera is, I think it's really hard to beat. And if I still want to bring both cameras, I think these are maybe a great combo to travel with. So how did it go? Honestly, pretty smoothly, even though I had some frustrating moments with the GR4, but overall I would say the experience was pretty good. The Leica Q3 handles very well, and especially with this added grip, it is very comfortable to use. Because the Ricoh GR is really small, it can sometimes be very fiddly to use. Even though my hands are not the biggest, I still had some issues with that. On the Ricoh GR, they added this plus and minus rocker here, and that is actually very useful for exposure composition, but it is also very easy to accidentally press it. And in fact, the first time I was shooting the camera, I accidentally was bumping it to +5 stops, and I was shooting at night, and at some point I looked at the screen and everything was just white. I couldn't see anything, and because it was raining and the camera got really wet, I thought, oh no, maybe the camera is already broken. It wasn't the case. After a minute or so fumbling around with the camera, it figured out that the problem was the exposure compensation, so I dialed it back and everything was fine. And ever since, it happened a few times, but then of course I knew what was going on. Unfortunately though, you cannot lock these buttons. I wish that Ricoh would give us the option, maybe with a future firmware update. That would be really appreciated, and I think that would be extremely useful. At least it's possible to turn off the touch function of the LCD screen, which is not possible on the Leica Q3, and I had some of my frustrating moments with the Q3 because of the touchscreen, and here you can simply turn it off, which is great. And besides that, the controls work actually pretty well. Another difference between these cameras is the autofocus. On the GR4, I would say it's pretty sluggish. The Q3 isn't great when it comes to autofocus, but it works all right, and overall I would say it works better than on the GR4. But to me personally, that is not a big issue since I use mainly zone focusing. So the autofocus, when I use it occasionally, it's okay, so not an issue to me. On the Leica Q3, you have this lovely focusing ring, and if you use zone focusing, this works extremely well. On the GR4, however, there's no focusing ring, but the way they implemented the manual focus works really well. You can simply press one button and then use plus and minus to change the distance accordingly. And on the left side of the screen, it will show you the distance, and according to your aperture that you set the camera in, it will also give you a preview of the depth of field, which is very useful, and I use it all the time and I had no issues with it. This made it extremely easy to use this camera for zone focusing. I know there's a lot of people out there that praise the Ricoh GR cameras for snap focus, which, if you don't know what it basically is if you fully press the shutter without the half press, it will focus to a certain distance that you can set up in the menu. I was not really using it because the manual focus works so well on this, and I'm not an autofocus user most of the time, so if you like that, it's good for you. But for me, the real surprising thing was that the way they implemented the manual focus on here, really great. The Ricoh GR has a much smaller sensor than the Leica Q3. It's an APS-C sensor. However, when it comes to image quality, it is really good. Yes, you can see the difference to the Q3 in terms of dynamic range and also low light noise, but I think overall the Ricoh GR is really good. And even when shooting at 800 ISO during the day or at night, or maybe 1600, and then pushing the files even further in Lightroom, they still look really great. And I think for street photography, there is not a big difference here. And I think I'm totally happy with what the Ricoh GR is giving me in terms of image quality. However, where I do have complaints is when it comes to the battery life of the Ricoh GR4. Even though the battery is a little bit bigger than on the predecessor, however, it's not great. On the strip I have 3 batteries with me, and also the external Ricoh battery charger that can charge up 2 batteries at once, but still it's not really great. And I had one issue that one day that made me switch over to the Leica Q3, and that has to do with these batteries here. Because we were shooting in the morning for a few hours and I drained pretty much all the batteries. Then I was back in my room and I charged the batteries before heading out back out in the afternoon. I was charging the batteries in the dual charger for maybe 2.5 hours, and they were not fully charged. So it takes very long to charge up these batteries, it's a shame, to be honest, because if I compare this battery to the ones in my DJI action camera, they have the same capacity, and my action camera, the battery is full in roughly 30 minutes, even though it was completely depleted before, so which is really good. I wish they had implemented fast charging into these batteries and also the battery charger. And like I said, on that one day, we went back out in the afternoon, and after, I don't know, 2 hours, I ran out of juice, so my Ricoh was pretty much dead. So that's the moment when I had to switch over to the Leica Q3, and I was glad that I brought it. Another big difference between the Q3 and the Ricoh GR is that it's using these micro SD cards, which is not great, but obviously this is a very small camera and there was probably not enough room. However, you still have the internal memory, which is around 50 gigabytes or something. But the weird part is you cannot use that internal memory as backup. I don't understand why. I thought before I bought the camera, I thought sure you will be able to use it as backup, but you can't. So in case you use the micro SD card, it dies, you don't have any backup, which is not great. Also, if you want to offload the files from the camera and maybe let's say you have them on the internal memory, the only way to get them off is by plugging the camera directly into your computer or laptop. And I did, and I was really shocked that the camera is not popping up as a drive. So, and the only way to get them off the camera is by using Lightroom, and then Lightroom will see the camera and then can import the files to whatever your locations you pick. And that worked on the first time, and it did not work the second time. So, yeah. I don't know what you're gonna do if then Lightroom cannot find the camera and you cannot offload the files. So that is not ideal. I don't know if this can be fixed maybe in a firmware update, but man, I wish the camera would just pop up as a drive, which would totally make sense. Another big difference between these two cameras when it comes to using flash, even though both have a leaf shutter built into the lens, is the fact that when I use this Godox X3 trigger to wirelessly use the flash, that I can only sync up to 1/1000th. If I go above, the flash will not show up. It's not a problem because I brought the flash that is a little bit more powerful, so I can lower the ISO or go or use a different aperture. But on the Leica Q3, I can sync the flash with this up to 1/1600th, and that works pretty well. So there's a little thing to consider here, but it might be different if you use a different combo here. However, if you use a cable or on-camera flash, you can sync at any speed. And on the Q3, it's 1/2000th max, and the max on the Ricoh GR is 1/4000th. However, you have to stop down to 5.6. If you're shooting at 2.8, it's 2500th. So, but still, it's really great.
Talking about flash. If you want to master using flash in street photography, check out my ultimate guide to flash in street photography video course. In it, I teach you everything you need to know to get started or to take your skills to the next level. Also this February, I have an amazing 7-day workshop coming up in Bangkok. Join us for an action-packed week full of street photography. Check it out. You'll find links to both the video course and the workshop in the video description. Or you can hop over to my website for more details.
Another huge difference between these two cameras, and that can be a deal breaker for some, is the fact that the Ricoh GR doesn't have weather sealing. And during the last 9 days, we had so much rain, it was unbelievable. It was so much that I'm glad that I not just brought this here, the Oberwelt that I pretty much carried all my gear in. And I also brought this bag here, the Wandered 6-liter sling, because I think my Oberwelt bag would have been completely ruined by all the rain that we had during the 9 days. It was absolutely insane. Again, on that last night of shooting, I was expecting heavy rain. In the end, it turned out there wasn't that much rain. It was drizzling a little bit. Later on, it poured a lot, but by then I was back in my room, so it didn't really affect me. However, I was also expecting a lot of dust, which is very typical when you use a lot of firecrackers. That's what they did in that night. And in fact, it was so bad that at some point I completely lost orientation because the visibility was maybe 2 to 3 meters max. So I couldn't see anything because there was so much smoke pretty much everywhere. And that's why I used the Leica Q3. And this is what the camera looked like after this night. And because I knew this up front, I thought maybe it's not a wise decision to use the Ricoh because I don't want the dust to get in the camera. And also, if it's raining, I don't want the camera to get wet. And because of the poor battery life, in all that chaos, maybe the rain, everything, I don't want to sit there and change batteries. This is probably not a good idea. So I thought it's probably wise to use the Leica Q3 instead, because the battery will last me all night long. Besides that, and the other occasion where I was running out of battery, I was using this camera pretty much for the whole 9 days. And overall, it was an absolutely great experience. Now, would I trade my Leica Q3 for the Ricoh GR4? Absolutely not. But I do think that these two cameras complement each other very nicely. And if you want to go out with, maybe, let's say you're on a trip, you bring both cameras and you just want to go out for a hike or just a little bit of random shooting, and you just want to make sure if something comes up, you have a camera. Well, if you bring this, especially with a really small flash, it's really hard to beat. This fits in your pocket and it is basically a little pocket rocket. All right, see you on the next one. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.